The courtroom was silent as the judge adjusted his glasses, peering down at the black man standing before him. The case had been dragging on for weeks, and today was supposed to be the final ruling. The white officers sat confidently at their table, their attorney smirking as if he already knew the outcome. The black man, James Carter, stood tall, his hands resting on the table in front of him. His suit was immaculate, his posture unwavering. But there was something about the way he carried himself, something restrained yet powerful, like a storm waiting to break. The officers had accused him of obstruction, of resisting their authority. The judge had listened to their testimonies, nodding along, his gavel tapping impatiently whenever James spoke. Officer Reynolds leaned back in his chair, arms folded, exuding arrogance. "Your Honor, this man refused to comply with our commands. We had reason to believe he was a threat." James inhaled sharply but held his tongue. His attorney had warned him to let the process unfold, but every part of him burned with the injustice of it all. He had been walking to his car when the officers had approached him, demanding his identification. He had done nothing wrong. Yet, when he had questioned their aggression, they had slammed him against his own car, cuffing him as if he were a criminal. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, adjusting his robe, "do you have anything else to add before I make my ruling?" James exhaled slowly. He could see the way the judge looked at him, the way the officers smirked as if victory was already in their grasp. "I do," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, the kind that made the officers shift slightly, though they quickly covered it up with their smug expressions. The courtroom waited. I complied with their commands. I presented my identification. And yet, I was still thrown against my vehicle, handcuffed, and humiliated in front of a crowd of people. He let his words hang in the air for a moment before he continued. I asked these officers one simple question. What was their reasonable suspicion? What crime did they suspect me of committing? Instead of answering, they used force. Officer Reynolds scoffed. He was being confrontational. James turned his gaze toward him, steady, unreadable. Confrontational? For knowing my rights. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, this court is not here to discuss your personal grievances. We are here to determine whether the officers acted within their legal authority." James smirked slightly, but there was no humor in it. "Legal authority?" His voice dropped lower, colder. "That's interesting. Because you see, Your Honor, I happen to know a lot about legal authority." Silence. James reached into his briefcase, pulling out a file. He laid it on the table in front of him, his fingers tapping at once. These officers assumed I was just another black man who would take their abuse quietly. They assumed wrong. He slid the folder forward. "Your Honor, I would like to formally introduce myself. My name is James Carter. I am a United States attorney." The room shifted. The smirks disappeared. The officers stiffened. The judge's face went pale. James let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "This entire time, I have listened to these officers twist the truth, painting themselves as the victims, while I was the aggressor. But the truth is, they made a mistake, and that mistake is about to cost them." The judge shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Carter." "No," James interrupted, his voice now carrying an authority that could not be ignored. "I let you all speak. Now it's my turn." The courtroom held its breath. I have spent years in courtrooms just like this one, prosecuting cases of corruption, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. And yet, despite my career, despite my knowledge of the law, I was still treated as nothing more than a suspect. Not because I was a threat, not because I committed a crime, but because of the color of my skin. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Their attorney opened his mouth to speak, but James cut him off with a look so sharp it could slice through steel. "These officers violated my rights," James continued, "and they thought they could get away with it because they assumed I was powerless. But I assure you, Your Honor, I am far from powerless." He placed another document on the table. "Here are my official complaints filed with the Department of Justice, detailing not only this incident, but other cases involving these officers. I have gathered witness statements, video footage, and reports of previous complaints against them. This isn't just about me. This is about a pattern of abuse that has gone unchecked for far too long. The judge fumbled with his gavel. The once confident officers now looked as though the walls were closing in on them. James leaned forward. So, Your Honor, before you make your ruling, I ask you one thing. Do you really want this case to be the one that exposes a system designed to protect officers like them at the expense of justice? Because I guarantee you, if you rule in their favor, I will take this case as high as it needs to go. And when the media, the public, and my colleagues in the DOJ get wind of this, it won't just be these officers facing scrutiny. A bead of sweat rolled down the judge's temple. He swallowed hard, looking at the officers, then back at James. The room was deathly silent. James didn't need to say anything else. He had already won. The only question that remained was, how far would they go to try and silence him? The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The judge, now visibly unsettled, adjusted his robe as if trying to compose himself. The officers sat rigid, their faces drained of color. Officer Reynolds, who had been so smug just moments ago, looked like he had swallowed a lemon. His partner, Officer Daniels, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward their attorney, who was suddenly fumbling through his notes as if searching for an escape route. But there was no escape. James had delivered a blow that none of them had seen coming. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't resorted to theatrics. He had simply laid out the truth, undeniable, irrefutable, and devastating. The weight of it was crushing them. The judge cleared his throat, his voice coming out strained. Mr. Carter, given this new information, I believe we may need to reassess certain aspects of this case. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the gavel in front of him. I would like to call for a short recess before proceeding any further. It was a weak attempt to regain control, but James wasn't going to let him off that easily. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his expression unreadable. A recess. His voice was calm, almost too calm. With all due respect, Your Honor, there is nothing to reassess. The facts are laid bare for everyone to see. The only question now is whether this court is willing to uphold justice or whether it will once again turn a blind eye to corruption. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, some of them already typing updates into their phones. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The judge wiped his brow, clearly realizing that whatever decision he made next would have consequences far beyond this courtroom. His eyes darted toward the officer's attorney, who gave him a look that was somewhere between desperation and pleading. Your Honor, the attorney said, standing abruptly, I believe my clients deserve a fair opportunity to defend themselves against these accusations. James let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. Accusations. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the attorney. That's an interesting choice of words. He reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out a small USB drive. Because, you see, I anticipated this very argument. He held up the drive for the courtroom to see. This contains body camera footage from the night in question. Footage that, for some reason, was conveniently left out of the police report. Footage that I obtained through a source within the department. The color drained from the officers' faces. The attorney's mouth opened, then closed again, his confidence crumbling. That evidence was never submitted. James cut him off with a sharp look. No, it wasn't. Because your clients tried to bury it. He walked toward the bailiff, handing him the drive. Let's play it, shall we? The judge hesitated, but he knew there was no stopping this now. With a reluctant nod, he signaled for the footage to be displayed. The courtroom screens flickered to life, and the grainy but clear video began playing. It showed the moment the officers had approached James in the parking lot. He was calm, standing beside his car, his hands visible at all times. Sir, we need to see some identification. Officer Reynolds' voice crackled through the speakers. May I ask why? James' voice was steady, controlled. We don't have to explain ourselves to you, Reynolds snapped. James retrieved his wallet, pulling out his ID. Here you go. The officers didn't even glance at it. Instead, Reynolds shoved him hard against the car. The sound of metal against fabric echoed in the courtroom. Whoa, there's no need for that, James protested, his voice still remarkably controlled. Stop resisting, Reynolds barked. I'm not resisting, James replied. But the video showed the truth. It showed how they manhandled him, how they ignored his compliance, how they escalated without reason. And then it showed the moment Reynolds leaned in, his voice a low whisper. We don't like your kind around here. The courtroom gasped. Someone in the back muttered, Oh my God. The judge paled, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. James turned back toward the officers, his face unreadable. Tell me, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Do you still stand by your statements? Do you still claim I was confrontational and resisting? Neither officer spoke. The attorney fumbled for words. This footage could have been tampered with. Really? James cut him off, raising an eyebrow. Because this copy came directly from the department servers. And if you'd like, we can call in an expert to authenticate it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it more menacing. Would you like to go that route? Because I promise you, I have all the time in the world. The attorney swallowed hard, looking to the officers for guidance. But they were frozen, their careers flashing before their eyes. The judge let out a shaky breath. Mr. Carter, in light of this overwhelming evidence, I believe we need to. No, James interrupted again. We don't need to delay. We don't need a recess. What we need is a ruling. His voice was no longer calm. It was steel. You see, Your Honor, too many people who look like me never get this moment. They never get the chance to present undeniable proof. They never get to see their abusers squirm in a courtroom. But today I do. And I am not going to let this moment slip away. The judge looked trapped, as though he had been backed into a corner he had spent his entire career avoiding. His eyes flickered toward the gallery, toward the reporters who were documenting every second of this historic reckoning. He knew there was no easy way out. He could no longer sweep this under the rug. A long silence stretched between them before the judge finally spoke, his voice weak, defeated. The charges against Mr. Carter are dismissed. James didn't move. The judge cleared his throat, his hands trembling as he reached for his gavel. Furthermore, I will be recommending an internal investigation into the conduct of these officers. Still, James didn't move. It wasn't enough. He could feel it in his bones. He turned to the officers. You think this ends here? His voice was softer now, more dangerous. You think losing this case is the worst thing that will happen to you? Reynolds swallowed hard, his face no longer full of arrogance. James smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had been pushed too far, a man who had been underestimated for the last time. I'm going to make sure your names are known, not as officers of the law, but as men who abused their power and got exposed for it. This is just the beginning. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers. Reporters were already typing their headlines. The judge slammed his gavel down. Court is adjourned. But James wasn't done. Not yet. He turned and walked toward the exit, feeling every eye in the courtroom on him. He had won this battle. But the war? That was just getting started. James walked out of the courtroom, his heart still pounding in his chest. The air outside was crisp, but it did nothing to cool the fire burning inside him. He had won, at least on paper. The judge had been forced to dismiss the charges, forced to acknowledge the corruption that had unfolded in broad daylight. But James knew better than to celebrate too soon. He had seen men like Reynolds and Daniels before. He had seen the system bend and twist to protect them, seen how easily accountability slipped through the cracks like water through clenched fingers. The court had ruled in his favor, but that didn't mean justice had truly been served. He knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. And if these officers thought they could hide in the shadows, if they thought they could walk away with their careers intact and their reputations only slightly bruised, they were sorely mistaken. He could hear the footsteps behind him, the hurried shuffling of reporters desperate for a statement. Cameras clicked, microphones were thrust forward, and voices clamored over one another. Mr. Carter, how do you feel about the judge's decision? Do you think the officers will face actual consequences? Will you be filing a civil suit? James exhaled slowly, stopping at the courthouse steps. He turned to face them, his gaze steady, unshaken. "This case isn't just about me," he said, his voice even but firm. "This case is about every black man and woman who has ever been falsely accused, mistreated, or silenced by a system designed to protect those in power. Today was a step in the right direction, but let me be clear, this is not the end. Those officers and everyone who tried to cover for them will be held accountable. I won't stop until they are." With that, he turned away, ignoring the barrage of questions that followed. He had said all he needed to say. Now it was time for action. That night, he sat in his apartment, staring at the wall, deep in thought. He had spent years fighting for justice, for the truth, but this time it was personal. He could still feel the weight of Reynolds' hands on him, still hear the venom in his voice when he had whispered those words. "We don't like your kind around here." It played in his head like a broken record, a reminder of how deep the rot ran. He had seen racism before, had fought against it in the courtroom time and time again, but this had been different. This time, he had been the one shoved against the car. This time, he had been the one forced to prove his innocence, despite doing nothing wrong. And the worst part? If he hadn't been who he was, if he had been just another black man with no title, no legal expertise, no connections, he would be sitting in a jail cell right now. Or worse. That thought made his blood boil. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Elijah, his best friend and fellow attorney. "Turn on the news." Elijah's voice came through the line, urgent and tense. James grabbed the remote and flipped to the local news station. His jaw tightened at what he saw. The screen showed Officer Reynolds and Officer Daniels walking briskly out of the courthouse, surrounded by a small group of fellow officers. Their faces were tight with anger, but the words at the bottom of the screen made James' stomach twist. No official disciplinary action expected against officers involved in case of U.S. Attorney James Carter. He clenched his fists. Elijah's voice was grim. "They're walking away from this, man. No suspensions, no firings. Just a slap on the wrist, and a don't do it again." James took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "Not if I have anything to say about it." And he did. He had more than just the courtroom. He had a voice. He had the truth. And he had power, real power, the kind that came with knowing how to use the system against those who had weaponized it for so long. The next morning, James made his move. He reached out to every journalist, every civil rights organization, every legal expert he knew. He released the full, unedited footage to the public. He wrote an open letter demanding accountability. He called for the immediate termination of Reynolds and Daniels, for a federal investigation into the department's handling of the case. And the world listened. Within hours, the video had gone viral. News anchors dissected every frame. Legal analysts debated the implications. Activists called for protests. The mayor was forced to address it. The police chief scrambled for a statement. The pressure mounted, growing by the minute, suffocating those who had hoped this would simply fade away. Then came the protests. Thousands filled the streets, chanting James' name, demanding justice. Signs were held high, faces full of fury and determination. The courthouse steps were packed with voices that refused to be silenced. Reynolds and Daniels became the face of everything wrong with the system. Their past misconduct, cases that had been quietly swept under the rug, were suddenly unearthed. Complaints from victims they had brutalized before came to light, their skeletons dragged from the closet for the world to see. They were no longer just two cops. They were symbols of a corrupt institution being exposed in real time. And then, the inevitable happened. The police department, desperate to contain the damage, announced an internal review. But it wasn't enough. The Department of Justice stepped in. A full federal investigation was launched. And just like that, Reynolds and Daniels weren't untouchable anymore. James watched it all unfold with a grim satisfaction. But he wasn't done yet. 2 months later, he stood in a courtroom once again. This time, he wasn't the defendant. He was the prosecutor. And the men sitting across from him weren't officers anymore. They were defendants. Stripped of their badges, facing charges that could put them behind bars. James looked at Reynolds, whose arrogance had been replaced with something else, fear. How does it feel? James asked, his voice low, dangerous. To sit on the other side of this table. Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't have to. His eyes said it all. For the first time in his life, he understood what it was like to be powerless. James leaned back in his chair, satisfaction settling deep in his bones. This was justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by men like these. And as he prepared to deliver his opening statement, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new fight. And he was ready for it.